In this podcast, we're going to take a look at the crisis of the 4th century for Jews. And primarily, this focuses on Hellenism and the introduction of Hellenism. So, Alexander the Great came through in 336. And so, we have a big change that sweeps over. Of course, there is archaeological evidence that there were some interactions between people living in Palestine and people from Greek before Alexander the Great. But with Alexander the Great came a huge influx of Greek culture. And so by Hellenism, what we're referring to really is a whole kind of cultural change. And this is really the total way of thinking and lifestyle which a group of people seeks to pass on from generation to generation. That's what's being meant here by it. And I'm using this definition of cultural change from J. Julius Scott, who has written a book about New Testament backgrounds. And so that's what Hellenism does. It brings a huge cultural change for Jews. The distinction that used to exist between Hellenism and Judaism was first introduced by the author of Second Maccabees. So this is part of the Apocrypha, and so it looks as if there are these, you can be a Jew, or there's this Hellenism that's coming about, and one might get the impression that a um, there could be Jews who are not Hellenized, but that's not really the case when it comes to what exists in the first century BC and in the first century AD, or the first century CE. These all Jews basically are Hellenized to one extent or another. They are all going to be affected by this cultural change brought on by the Greeks. There are three distinctive features of Hellenistic culture, which I'm going to just talk about here very briefly. There is a distinction in government, a distinction in the daily life, and what I'm going to call or refer to as the Greek spirit. So, first of all, in terms of government, areas primarily are divided into kind of like city-states. And usually these city-states would have a king, and these kings usually have some kind of absolute power. Their kings would interact, though, with a council, a boule, is this Greek term that's used. And the council is made up of either citizens or elected representatives. So when we think of councils in Palestine, one of the big councils is the Sanhedrin. And so there is some suggestion from at least Mishnah that it was a greater Sanhedrin and a lesser Sanhedrin. So these different councils, and these councils would have been made up of kind of leading individuals, probably some from the priesthood and probably some from aristocracies, who oversee the welfare of the city. Now, in terms of Hellenistic citizenship, tends to focus on an urban environment, not so much on people in the countryside. And so cities are a big deal um, for Greek culture. The city is really where life is supposed to happen. The native Greeks and upper class foreigners are people who can enjoy Hellenistic citizenship. So citizenship does not really belong to a lot of people who are either not native Greeks or who come from the lower classes. The marketplace, what's known as the agora, was the center of political, religious, and commercial activities. And so one of the characteristics of a Greek city is if it has an agora, if it has a marketplace. And that's one of the things we start seeing pop up in Palestine is there are cities that are built, and these cities tend to be built with kind of a Greek style, and they have agoras. And so, and this is where you kind of people exchange these ideas, they exchange goods, and they, discuss or oversee the life of the city. The gymnasium was the center of education and exercise, and so this is where you send your young men to get a education and things like reading and rhetoric and mathematics. So this is where education happens, and also this is where they get physically fit, because within the Greek mind there is a connection between the physical body, health of the body, and the health of the mind. And we see that during the Hellenistic period within Judaism, gymnasiums are being built. This becomes an interesting problem, especially under Antiochus Epiphanes, because a gymnasium is built, and there are certain Jews who want, the more aristocratic Jews, who want to send their sons to the gymnasium to get an education in kind of the Greek style, which is now the kind of the new uh, cultural representation of power and prosperity, and they want their sons to go there. But if they're going to the gymnasium to get an education and to participate in athletic games oftentimes were done in the nude, and so this is a problem for Jews in one sense, because Jewish boys are circumcised, whereas Greeks are not. And if their circumcision is seen, it is a source for being made fun of and being ridiculed. And so what Maccabees indicates is that some Jewish families actually tried to reverse circumcision on their children in order so that they can fit in to these kinds of activities, which the author of First Maccabees just sees as abhorrent, because the circumcision of, of, of males is a sign of their faithfulness to the covenant. So, but gymnasiums are these centers of education, and we begin to see evidence that they are being introduced in Palestine. Herod the Great is somebody who also builds gymnasiums to further extend the influence, as it were, of Greek thought, Greek culture. Even though he works for the Romans, the Greek culture becomes dominant even in the Roman period. Rhetoric was also at the center of education, so being able to know how to be persuasive, how to organize your thoughts, and how to take individuals and audience through your message and to influence them. And so there are actual handbooks on rhetoric that exist today that we can consult. And so rhetoric is a very important thing, especially as we examine New Testament books. We are interested, scholars are quite interested in how much of our New Testament was actually organized and structured around rhetorical techniques that had been taught by the Greeks. So Paul's letters, are oftentimes examined in this way. The Gospels are examined in this way. So for these rhetorical techniques that would indicate a certain level of education that the authors would have been exposed to. Also, finally, just want to talk about the Greek spirit here. And so generally for the Greek spirits, the primary virtues among Greeks is living in harmony with one another, pursuing wisdom. Now, wisdom for the Greeks is more than what is thought of amongst Jews. For Jews, wisdom is quite a very practical thing in terms of how to live life in such a way that one can prosper, one can develop, stay away from danger. But wisdom is also tied to the idea of law observance. So for a Jew to be wise is to live out a life in faithfulness to Torah. But for the Greeks, wisdom can be speculative. to pursue wisdom, like philosophy is kind of this love of wisdom, is to pursue concepts and ideas that are much more abstract. Courage is a very important virtue for the Greek spirit. So, how do you live courageous lives? How do you demonstrate that you are a person of courage? Temperance, so showing moderation, showing controls, showing that you don't allow your emotions or you don't allow other things to control you. So, of course, the concept of freedom is very important, and that real human life is that marked by freedom. So, being a slave certainly is no ideal because you are bound or controlled. You have a master. So you want to be temperate over anything that you're involved in, using moderation, so that these things don't have control of your life. Endurance, so under suffering, so your ability to persevere, to continue pursuing the good that should be pursued, despite any tribulations or um, discomfort that may come your way, and of course the pursuit of justice, what is right, with in relationships to human beings. So those are some of the primary virtues. Life is dominated by fate, so that the world is kind of set on around certain things happening. And the meaning of life is really to avoid pain and unhappiness. So there are several different kinds of philosophies that get started. At one extreme would be hedonism. Hedonism is just whatever makes me happy for the moment. I'm going to pursue that. But not everybody was supportive of hedonism because, you could have these excesses, but these excesses lead to some kind of pain in your life, and that's not what you want. Epicureanism is another more popular philosophical outlook, and it tried to um, advocate for these moderations. So you try to, you want to enjoy life, and you want to do those things that bring pleasure, but you also have to show moderation in those things so that you are not controlled by them or it doesn't lead you to an unhappy or painful state. So Epicurean philosophy as well stressed this freedom and pleasure. So you want to be um, free from anything that can control you. And if you're going to be free, one of the things you as well pursue is contentment. Because if you are um, discontent, then that means you are, in a sense, probably enslaved to something that you must pursue in order to be content. So the Epicurean does not want to behold to anyone. They don't want to be dependent upon anyone. So Epicurean philosophy, Stoicism. Now, Stoicism is a really important philosophy for this time. It's very popular. Stoicism also stressed living in harmony with order and submitting here what we call the logos. So this Greek word logos simply means word, and within Stoic thought, there is a power that governs the world called the logos, and the rational person lives in harmony with what has been determined by the logos. The irrational person tries to resist what has already been determined by logos. So accepting, submitting to one's life and one's positions, one's place in the world, and learning to live appropriately within that status or within that state. So, classical religion probably had little impact and was primarily used for ceremonial purposes. So, by classical religion, I'm thinking about the gods that were served, and you know these things, while they were prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world, seeing these gods, what had greater impact were probably the philosophies, and but many people still participate in um, the activities of recognizing gods and the classical religions of an earlier period. Mystery religions were also a popular thing during this time, and these mystery religions offered saviors and relationships with other humans and gods. So, for example, there are what we call mystery religions. These were the cults of, say, Isis and Dionysius, the Sibyl, Hermes, Orpheus, Mithras. Um, and so, for some of the major components of these mystery religions are, they're highly symbolic systems, and they're going to employ myths or allegories and liturgies, and they're going to use these to create a symbolic space for mythical experience or union with the divine. So you're entering into these things in order to have some kind of relationship with the God, a union with the God, to dwell with the God. And so what they did is they utilized different kinds of rites or rituals which seek to emotionally exalt the participant through dramatic enactments. So you do things, you're engaged in particular activities, and these activities bring the worshiper into this communion with God. So also, mystery cults oftentimes had kind of esoteric knowledge, knowledge of another world given only to the initiate, and this pertains to the salvation of the initiate. So, these initiates want to be saved, maybe not saved in this sense that many Christians might think about today, saved one day, but saved right now in the moment from whatever forces there might be, or saved from one's own um, captivity that they have created. And you do this when you gain a certain knowledge. So this getting access to that knowledge, but you only get that knowledge once you have been allowed in. So these mystery cults promise a kind of salvation, but you have to go through an initiation process. And once you are in, then you know about the God, and you know about things, the will of this God, and then you're allowed to experience this salvation. There's a concern with eschatology in some of these mystery religions, a connection between this life and some kind of world that is coming. And it's very personal, highly personal. These cults, volitional. People, are not coerced into it, or they shouldn't be coerced into it. It's a volunteer type of thing. And there's a great deal of speculation about the cosmos and the stars and what's going on in the universe and how it's affecting humanity. So mystery religions were a part of the Greek spirit and highly influential at the time of Christianity. And finally, for the Greek spirit, it's just this kind of cultivation of the mind and body was a part of the culture and religious ceremonies. So trying to do those things to gain knowledge, trying to do those things that protect the body or buffet the body, keep the body healthy. Those are things that are seen as things that should be pursued by the knowledgeable person, by the good person. They try to focus on those areas, and that's done not only in culture but also through religious ceremonies. All right, so that gives you a little bit of some of the aspects of Hellenism. Uh, you know, one really needs to appreciate Hellenism in order to understand the New Testament, since, well, first of all, we can see that the New Testament that is written about a Jewish person and whose followers were initially Jews who probably spoke Aramaic. Nevertheless, they are written in Greek. And so the use of the Greek language is already evidence as a way in which the early Christianity is influenced by Greek thought. So there are other areas that we'll talk about in the course where this Hellenistic context impacts what people are thinking and doing.